Hello anime fan, welcome back to What If Animes 2.0. So in this video you gonna see, what if cursed Naruto was reborn in fairy tale and had a harem with Mirajane. This is part 1. And if you want more, then hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe. So let's getting the video and do check out the author of the story. In a dim lit room stood a young boy. Papers and scrolls were littered all around him as he kept on scribbling on his notebook. He stopped for a second as he thought he heard something. He scanned the area around him, yet he could see nothing nor sense anyone. Slowly he turned his attention back to the notebook and sneered as he cut off what he wrote up until now. Lines and lines of seals and notes about each seal. The boy sighed as he looked around, trying to figure out something else. He grabbed a nearby scroll that he borrowed from the higher-ups. They wouldn't have let him get his hands on this no matter what. It held secrets that if discovered would either bring peace to a soul or devastation to those around them. A complicated seal is what people described it, something that only a genius like its inventor could understand and something that only his offspring would be able to crack. Yet his legacy died a long time ago, so people say. The boy learned not to trust them eventually. The world around him was shrouded in lies and mystery. Mystery itself wasn't bad, he enjoyed solving it, but the lies, he despised it. From birth he had been lied to. With no one to look after him, he grew up by himself, taking care of himself and trying to grow as a model citizen. Yet he soon came to understand that those around him would never view him as more than trash or an abomination. He learned that trying to be a simple citizen would not work. It took a lot of convincing and a lot of pleas to get enrolled in the academy, to become one of the military's backbone in both the economy of the village and its military defense. It disgusted him as he learned that he was supposed to lie his way through with every action he took, with every step he took. Everything about him, about his comrades and about the army in general was a big lie. They were puppets to those with power. They did as they were told and they lied as they were told. They kept him especially on a short leash. Learn only what they give you. Ask only what they allow you to ask. Never talk unless they say so. The others, they had more freedom. They were different, special in their eyes, unlike him. Each and every one of them came from families that either had great influence over the higher powers, held the power in their hands themselves, or were just better than him. They had training from young age. They had the means to learn faster than him. They knew more than he would ever know. There was only one person that looked after him, and he died a long time ago. They said it was an assassination, hence why they went to war against two nations. To him, it was just desire for blood to be shed. To him, it seemed like the only thing they wanted was to be on top, to show the world that they are the best. He, however, didn't care for petty things like that. He wanted to be free, and to attain that freedom he needed to get rid of that which gave him infinite power. After his guardian's funeral he learned the truth, what kept him ticking and what made him special. But at the same time, he learned from where all the anger came, why he had no parents and why no one cared for him. His mentor, his teacher, the one that later on became his squad leader, he was supposed to be his relative, maybe not by blood, but it was stated so. Yet the man turned a blind eye when it came to him. He despised his very existence as if he had taken the most precious thing from him. The truth was more horrible than that, however. The man did not hate him for what he was. He hated his birth mother and in turn hated him, the human being. It brought a small, albeit sad, smile to the boy's face. At least someone hated him for being human. He scowled, however. The man was a pitiful excuse for human, taking up space and breathing the air around him, wasting it on nothing. He did as he was told and kept his mouth shut, however. He didn't go against his will or his orders. But there were times when he wanted to do the right thing, to gut him, to feed him to the demons and let his soul be dragged into oblivion. But he didn't do that. He wouldn't do that. Unlike them, he was a human being. He had a heart. The boy shook his head as he put out the candle and stood in silence. Footsteps echoed outside the room, in the rain. "Did you hear about B Company?" the voice asked. The boy didn't bother trying to figure out who it was that asked the question. There were a lot of military personnel in this ravaged city. The city itself belonged to one of the other great nations. He didn't bother to find out which. He was never told anyway. They only told him to go to a place, kill off all resistance and hold his ground until the rest of the detachment arrived. He shivered as he remembered what they did once they arrived here. He made sure to do as he was told. They told him to keep the civilians alive and not let them leave. He thought they would spare them, offer them a new home, protection. Instead they murdered them. He watched helplessly as they killed off every one of them, as if they were animals. Young, old, it didn't matter, they all had to die, or so they said. They cursed him and called him a demon, a monster, for letting all that happened. He felt sick, he wanted to leave this place, he wanted to be free. Yay, I heard their demon massacred the entire company. The other replied, the boy heard them come to a stop right next to the window of the house he was hiding in. He looked at the collar around his neck and snarled. The device told the leader of the company he was part of if he left without telling anyone, if he ran away. We should send ours to battle it. Maybe they will kill each other off. The first one stated and began laughing, his comrade joined him. The boy grit his teeth as he felt his eyes watering. True, but we still have a use for it. He replied as silence soon followed. The boy stood, waiting for them to leave so he could resume his work. He knew they were outside, he could feel their energy. Yay, we can kill it in the end. The Hokage has a special jutsu. The boy's head snapped up as his eyes widened in fright. Yay, heard it cost him quite a fortune to find that scroll. Apparently it was created by the sage to kill off demons for good. The other one stated cheerfully as the boy shivered and lowered his head. You too, someone shouted as he heard the men outside scramble, probably going into a salute pose. Sir. They shouted as the officer walked towards them. The boy didn't look up. From the voice he knew who it was. What are you doing here? Get back to your posts, he yelled as the men began running away. The boy began to pray, hoping the officer wouldn't look in the window, that he wouldn't try to see if there was anyone in here. He heard the man approaching and he began to shiver. The officer had enough power to make him feel pain, to make him unable to move for days if possible. The man suddenly stopped, he looked around and then left. The boy sighed in relief, that was too close for his own good. Carefully, he leaned towards the candle and lit it back up, illuminating the area around him. He looked down on the scrolls once more and continued reading, scribbling and thinking. He had to succeed, he had to get this done today, there was no tomorrow, he would never get another chance like this. He hated everything about this world, there was nothing here for him. Those that actually loved him are dead. Those that said they believed in him, that they cared for him, left him in the end, betrayed him. This world was forsaken by God, left to handle itself and left to go on without his guidance. There was no reason for him to stay here and suffer at the hands of those men. Time passed, the night slowly turned into day, the boy was getting more and more nervous. He then felt a tug from his collar, he was being summoned by the commander of the detachment, there was no more time to waste. The jutsu might be incomplete, but if he was right, then the tribute he would be offering to the death god should suffice. It should be enough to let him ask the god to be sent in another world, somewhere he could actually live like a normal human being. The boy looked out the window, he could see the sun rising and he could hear the chatter outside, people were waking up. He stood up in the pentagram and began flashing through hand seals, his eyes following the scrolls as they slowly burned with each seal he made. It was a one-way trip. It was a way to make sure no one would follow him, that he would be free for good. As he reached the last seal, the door was flung open, the windows shattered and ninjas appeared in the room, circling the boy. Uzumaki, the commander yelled in fury. The boy looked up with a glare and whispered one final word before flames consumed. Burn in hell. The ninjas covered their eyes as the flames consumed the blonde boy. They jumped back as the circle seemed to spew more and more fire. They ran out as a demonic laughter resonated throughout the house, the laughter echoing throughout the world. A god was pleased with today's sacrifice, yet, a demon was not. The mighty demon, sealed within the boy since his birth, raged as the hands of death reached out towards it. It glared towards its host, cursing him, yet the boy was unfazed, he smiled, he laughed and he taunted. Finally he was going to be free, finally his torment would end. The fox, however, did not agree with that. You fool, you believe I will let you win? It roared as the boy continued laughing and cheering, something he hadn't done since he was a young lad. I curse you, Uzumaki, I curse you. The demon shouted, he will not be defeated like this, he will make sure that the accursed boy would forever remember him, that he would forever be scarred for what he had done. You will regret this even after you die. It shouted. The boy, however, looked up at it with a serene smile as his laughter died down. No, fox, I will not regret this, I will never regret my decision. My father cursed me, I lifted my curse and left for new lands. he said as he looked up towards the hand of the death god. I paid the price, tenfold. I deserve happiness, you will get nothing. The demon shouted as its tails lashed out. They ripped through the seal and moved towards the boy whose serene face turned into a look of horror. He tried to turn and run but the tails were faster. They grabbed him and threw him to the ground. He screamed as the fox began laughing for its victory. I will make sure you remember me. It whispered as its power began flowing through its tails. I will make sure that the people of the world you are going in will hate you. It roared as the blonde screamed in pain. The boy felt like his flesh was being torn from inside out. He howled as he felt like his head would explode. I will make you feared. The fox roared before all its power surged through the boy's body, rendering him unconscious. The fox slowly took its tails away and began laughing. Slowly each tail began to vanish, and despite the pain it was feeling from death, it still laughed, it still grinned. In the end, it had won. I curse you, boy, its voice echoed as it vanished from the seal. I curse you for all eternity. The boy grumbled as he felt the familiar smell of antiseptics invade his nostrils. He inwardly groaned and cried, thinking his jutsu had failed. Slowly, however, he opened his eyes and looked around. He was in a hospital room, but he was sure this wasn't one of the makeshift emergency rooms from the battlefield or Konoha's hospital. The machinery here was different, very different. To him it looked much more advanced than what they had back home. The door suddenly slid open, drawing his attention. He tensed as he saw a young woman enter the room. The woman looked at the blonde and her face turned into a big smile, something that caught the boy off guard. You're awake, he said with glee evident in her voice, like he had been asleep for years. The doctor was afraid you'd never wake up. She continued as she hurried over to his side and began checking him. Naruto didn't know what to make of this. Everything was beyond what he had expected as a reaction from a nurse. She seemed happy that he was awake. Back home they would have wanted him to never wake up. They would have wanted him to sleep for all eternity. How long was I gone? He asked with a rough voice. The nurse looked towards him and frowned a little. You were out cold for about 3 weeks, she said as she shook her head and took the clipboard from the bed. I have no idea how you survived in that freezing water. She continued, making the blonde raise an eyebrow. What? He asked as the nurse looked at him and then back at the clipboard. She wrote something on it and then took a seat next to the blonde's bed. She looked at him with a small smile as she began to explain. The commander of the Royal Guard found you floating in the river next to his home, up in the mountains. She explained. At the word, commander, the blonde held his breath a little, but as he heard the term, Royal Guard, he pondered. This was a new term to him and he was more than sure no one in the elemental countries ever had something like that. Something wrong? She asked, raising an eyebrow. The blonde slowly shook his head, his training coming back to him. He didn't need the woman to suspect something. The nurse looked at him for a few more seconds before lifting the clipboard. I know this is a bit sudden, but I'd like to ask you some questions, she stated as the blonde nodded. First thing, what is your name? She inquired as the blonde pondered if he should use a fake name or if he should give her his real name. After all, if the jutsu was a success then he was in another world now. After thinking for a few seconds the blonde looked towards her and replied. Uzumaki Naruto, he stated as the woman smiled and nodded. She began writing down his name on the clipboard. Date of birth? She asked as the blonde pondered over the question one more time. Instead of answering the question he decided to find out where he was, to get some idea before giving away a time that would seem too strange. Where am I? He asked slowly, looking out the window. The nurse frowned a bit as she looked at the window and then back at the boy. You are in Fury Naruto-san, she replied, in the town of Tacha at the base of Mount Juma. The blonde nodded slowly as he looked back at the nurse. He had never heard of the town, the country or the mountain. Now, if you could tell me your date of birth, she said as the blonde looked around with the corner of his eyes, trying to find a calendar or something to see the current date. Yet he couldn't see anything. He decided to improvise. I don't know, he replied, his voice low as he looked down at the sheets. I only know my birthday is on October 10th, he stated as the woman frowned slightly. All right, let's try this then. How old are you? She asked as the blonde immediately replied, telling her that he was 15 years old. Place of birth? She then asked as the blonde stood silent and looked back down at the sheets in deep thought. The boy sighed as he looked out the window, still in deep thought. The woman shook her head. Oh my, she said silently, amnesia. The blonde inwardly smirked. Maybe the army did thought him something. Maybe they weren't that bad, at least when it came to his own survival. Relatives? She asked, hoping for something, yet the blonde looked down sadly and shook his head. Not that I know of. Grandfather died a long time ago. Never met my mom or dad. He replied as the woman nodded sadly. With a sigh she stood up and looked at him. If you need anything, push that button there, she told him, pointing towards a strange circle-like device in the wall. The blonde nodded dumbly as the woman giggled a little. She turned around and walked out of the room, probably to find the doctor. This gave the blonde time to think. It was too soon to decide if he was really in another world. He could have been sent to the other continents, beyond the veil. But he couldn't know for sure, yet. If he was beyond the veil he was safe. He was more than sure about that. No one, not even the great sage, could leave the islands. He couldn't traverse the veil. But he felt like he wasn't in his world, not even beyond the veil. If there was one thing certain, that was the fact that the death god never goes against his word. If you strike a deal with him and pay accordingly, he will keep his end of the bargain. A small smile appeared on his face. It seemed like things were looking up to him now. It seemed like everything was going accordingly to plan. Carefully, he brought his hands out from under the covers and looked at them. He looked at all the scars he had and frowned a bit. Signs that he wielded a weapon, signs that he did hard labor. While hard labor would prove good in this world to start over, from scratch, if people would know the truth they would ask questions, and he didn't know what to tell them. He had no story. Or at least not one that was plausible in his mind. He was cut out of his musings as the door suddenly slid open. He calmly let his hands drop on the covers and looked at the door. An old man with white coat entered, followed by a man in a strange metal armor. The blonde knew that the first one was the doctor, the second, he had no idea who he was. He studied the man with great interest. The armor was that of a knight from stories he read when he was little. The design of a wolf's head was present on the chest. He was carrying his helmet in his arms. The blonde looked at the man's face. He wasn't old, nor young, a man in his 40s if he was right. Brown eyes, black hair and a 5 o'clock shave. There was one distinctive characteristic above the knight, and that was the scar over his right eye and the fact that his right eye didn't seem natural. To the blonde it seemed like a fake. He wondered if he could see with that eye. Mr. Uzumaki, the doctor started, drawing the blonde's attention. My name is Yusuke Abunaga, doctor of St. Claus Hospital, he stated as the blonde listened carefully. The man next to me is Knight Commander Rhonda, the man that found you. The blonde looked towards Rhonda, who bowed slightly, a sign of respect. Or his way to say hello? That he didn't know. It's nice to meet you, the blonde replied as the doctor smiled slightly and walked next to the blonde's bed. The knight followed suit, stopping at the end of the bed. His eyes constantly locked with the blonde's form, as if the blonde would try anything. The nurse gave me the clipboard. She says you might have amnesia, he stated slowly, as if not believing a word. Tell me, are you a mage? He asked as the blonde looked at him like he was stupid. Mage? What is that? He asked, genuinely curious. The man looked up in shock before shaking his head and then looking down at the clipboard again. Yes, he mumbled to himself, yet he did not reply to the question. What year are we in? He inquired further as the blonde blinked. He didn't give the boy time to reply as he turned back to scribbling on the clipboard and mumbling to himself. Well, doctor? The knight asked in a rough voice as the man scratched his chin, mumbling to himself. It reminded the blonde of some sort of man doctor. At least the way he was acting did. Unfortunately, we do not have any equipment here to scan him, nor do we have mages in our staff. So for now I will go with amnesia, the doctor stated, stressing the word out as if not believing the blonde and thinking that he was bluffing everything. The knight, however, didn't seem fazed to the underlined meaning of the word and looked towards the blonde with interest. He told the doctor he wished to speak with the boy alone. The doctor left, not having a choice in the matter. There was no way he was going to say no to the knight commander. As the doctor left the room, the knight turned his attention back to the blonde. He walked closer and took a seat next to the bed. Naruto gulped a little, not knowing what the man would do. I believe, he started as he pulled out his sword. This made the blonde's eyes narrow. His eyes then widened as he recognized the sword. This is yours, the man finished, holding up the dead katana. The blonde fidgeted a little as the knight placed the sword on the ground and turned his attention back to the blonde. When I found you, you were wearing a slave collar, he stated as the blonde looked up in wonder. How did the man know what it was? Or so we believe. Care to clarify? He inquired as the blonde looked away, trying to make it look like he didn't remember or know. The man sighed as he stood up. You have two choices: come clean and tell us your story, or we assume you are a dark mage and we lock you up. He then turned around and began walking towards the door. Naruto didn't know what to do now. He didn't know what a dark mage was, but from the fact that the knight said they would lock him up, it could only mean that they were something like bandits or thieves. Or worse. He looked up, and just as the knight was about to open the door and leave, the boy called out for him. Wait! The knight halted. A smile appeared on his lips. He turned around and his smile dropped, his face turning into a passive expression once more. Yes, that is a slave collar, he replied with his head downcast. He didn't know what they would do now that he told them that. It wasn't quite the truth. It wasn't a slave collar, more like an obedience collar. Something to make sure that if he ran away they would be able to weaken him and stop him in his tracks before he could get too far away. You don't need to worry. The commander's voice was soft. The blonde's head snapped up as he looked towards the man. Slavery is banned in Fury. You will not be sent back to the one that owned you. The man spat out as if it would burn him by just saying that word. If you can, however, tell us the name of the one that did this to you, we will make sure he is sent behind bars. The blonde felt his heart skip a beat. He felt his eyes watering because of the sudden information. It made him happy knowing this. For a second he was afraid that he would be held by a leash in this world as well, just because he had been held by one in the previous world. He thanked the commander and at the same time apologized. He couldn't remember the names. He told him that he barely remembered anything from before waking up. It was a lie, but he just couldn't tell the man that he came from another world where he had been used as a tool to fight for someone. After the blonde calmed down, the knight resumed his questioning. I'd like to know how you got away, if you remember that, he said as the blonde looked at the katana. I fought my way out, he told the man in an emotionless voice. I killed my way out, he continued. The boy then looked back up at the knight. He didn't seem fazed by that, like killing was an everyday occurrence in this world. The blonde hoped not, however. I see, you did struck me as a warrior. The man mumbled to himself, something that the blonde had heard. What do you plan on doing after you are discharged from the hospital? Rhonda asked curiously. Naruto looked at the man in the eyes, then he looked down at his hands and wondered. He didn't know what to do. He had no idea, and he didn't plan for something like this. The knight saw the boy's distress and his eyes softened a little. He remembered that the nurse told them he was an orphan with no living relatives alive. He might be an old, but he had an idea. If he was really a strong warrior, he had a plan. How about this? You can live at my place until you figure out what to do. And if you still don't know, I could offer you a place in the royal guard. The knight said, making the blonde look up in wonder. We are always looking for new recruits, he said with a small smile as the blonde looked down and thought. Can I think about it? He asked as the knight nodded and stood up. You do that, and when you have an answer let me know. I will return in the morning, he said as he walked towards the door. Before he left, he heard a barely audible, thank you. He grinned as he left the room. A week had passed before the blonde was let to leave. The first thing the blonde did when he got out of bed was look at himself in the mirror. At first he screamed when he saw himself, alerting the nurse that ran in to check what happened. He excused himself, saying that he was startled by something he imagined. The nurse laughed at that and left him alone. The blonde was surprised when he saw himself in the mirror. He was still his old self, the blonde boy with blue eyes. But there was one thing missing. He had no more whiskers. He pinched himself and rubbed his cheeks, but in the end he was sure he wasn't imagining it. He had no more whiskers. Over the course of the week he had gotten to know the knight commander better. Rhonda lived at the outskirts of a small village in the mountain. Bandits were a very rare sight there due to the strong presence of the royal guard in the nearby castle, just a few kilometers away from Rhonda's house. The man lived with his wife, and from what he understood they had no offspring. The man dodged questions about that. It made the blonde think that something bad had happened if they did have an offspring. He didn't press forward on the subject. Rhonda brought the blonde up to date with the new world. The knight believed he was telling an amnesiac something he would know if he remembered. The boy was amazed at what he heard. He began to wonder if his chakra was anything like magic. But when he tried to do simple tricks like henge or kawarimi, nothing worked. He could still feel his energy flowing through his body. He could still access it to walk on walls and use it to disrupt machinery, but other than that, he couldn't do anything else. At first he was worried, though he did not show it. When the knight told him that mages can live on even if they run out of magic, he felt jealous. He had limited supplies that needed to be refilled, and if he were to exhaust them all he would die. He was completely different, unlike the mages here. But the fact that he could not use any jutsus now, it opened up new doors for him. He tried to keep a positive outlook on everything. If he couldn't use chakra to fight anymore, then maybe there was no point in fighting. He had a bit of training in the art of smithy. He knew how to forge basic weapons such as daggers. If he could learn more, he could start a shop and live a normal life. But then again, he felt like the normal life wasn't all that grand. He would miss the excitement. When he was young, there was excitement in being part of the army. That is when the old man was still alive, so he thought of taking up Rhonda's offer. On the last day before leaving, he had a light spar with the commander. The man was impressed with the blonde's skill, with a wooden stick, and the blonde was glad he still knew how to wield a weapon. Rhonda told the blonde that he would instruct him at home how to fight like a royal guard, as his stance was no good when fighting arm to arm with brothers. The blonde knew that his swordsmanship relied on 1 versus 1, or 1 versus an entire army. He always fought alone in the past, he always looked after his back alone in the past, but now, it was going to change. The trip to the knight's place was uneventful, at least in some points. The commander had been amused by the blonde the whole way. He acted like a small child that was seeing something new for the first time in his life. They stopped numerous times on their way so that the blonde could look at things that in his eyes he deemed incredible and exciting. Rhonda was surprised that Naruto had been lured away by simple magic tricks. Even though the man performing them was a real mage, the tricks usually only appealed to young kids. The boy was a teen already, and yet when he laid his eyes on the simple illusion, he was drawn in. Even while walking through the forest, the man was forced to walk at a more subdued pace as the blonde went on the explore everything he came across. While the boy did stick to the road and didn't venture in the forest, he would take his time in looking at everything, amazed by what he was seeing. The knight felt sad for the boy. If life for a slave was this harsh, then he dreaded to imagine what would have happened if the blonde never had the courage to fight back and remained a slave forever. By the time they reached Rhonda's house, it was already dark outside. The village was quiet, and apart from 2 guards that were patrolling on the streets, there was no one else outside. When they reached the knight's place, they were greeted by his wife, a woman in her late 30s with long blonde hair and green eyes. She scolded her husband for being late, something that brought a smile to the blonde's lips, though he did not know why. As the two were busy, the wife scolding the husband who was trying to explain why he was late, the blonde looked around the place. He could see a river a few feet away. The knight told him he fished the blonde out of that river. He chuckled a little at that, imagining the knight with a fishing rod, fishing him like he was some sort of fish. He then looked at the house. It was a small house but welcoming, a nice garden in front of it with flowers and a fence. Not far from the house he could see a small stable, most likely where the knight's horse was. "Naruto," he heard the knight call out. He turned around and saw the knight with his arm around his wife's waist. She was looking at him with a kind smile. "I'd like you to meet my wife," he said as he looked towards her. The woman giggled as she gave a small bow. "It's nice to meet you. My name is Alejandra," she said as the blonde blushed from her act. She didn't need to bow before him. "You Uzumaki Naruto," he replied with a small stutter as the woman giggled at his reaction. "Come on in." She beckoned, moving away from her husband and walking towards the house. "I'm sure you're famished," she said with a smile as the blonde nodded, his stomach growling in agreement. As he stepped in the house, he felt something he had never felt before: warmness and security. The house wasn't anything the blonde hadn't seen before, considering how many houses he invaded in the other world, but it felt different than all the other. As he sat at the table in the kitchen and waited for Alejandra to prepare the food, he inspected the world around him, taking account of everything that was in the kitchen. He saw photos and paintings on the walls, pots with flowers. The blonde's attention snapped to the table as the woman placed a dish with food in front of him. He looked at the dish and smiled slightly. He thanked her and began eating slowly, enjoying the taste and savoring it fully. "I see you like it," Alejandra said with a smile as Rhonda sat down in front of the blonde. She moved behind her husband and placed her hands on his shoulder. The blonde nodded happily and thanked her again, making the woman giggle. "I prepared a room for you. My husband told me you will be staying with us for quite some time," she said as the blonde looked up at her. "If there is anything you need, feel free to ask. We'll gladly help you." The knight nodded in agreement as the blonde smiled widely and nodded vigorously. "I will," he exclaimed, "thank you. I promise I'll repay you one day," he said once more with a big grin making Rhonda laugh. "No, Naruto. There is no need for you to repay us," he said kindly as his wife nodded. "Yes, no one should live a life of slavery, we're happy to help those in need," she said as the blonde looked down with a sad smile. He nodded and proceeded to eat his food in silence. He had no more doubts that he was in a new world now. After he was done with his food, the knight and his wife guided him to his new room. They left him alone so that he could accommodate. The blonde was happy with his new life, even if it just started. He crashed on the bed and looked up at the ceiling with a large smile on his face. While the demon's last words scared him, he didn't think about them too much now, not anymore. He was already planning for the next day, making a schedule. The blonde was planning to explore the village, to get to know the people. Maybe he would live here in the end, settle down here. Naruto blushed slightly. He never thought about this, but in this world he would be able to get that special someone, fall in love with a girl that is not a bitch, for one that would not betray him. The blonde's smile turned into a sad one for a moment as he thought back. He quickly shook his head, dismissing the thoughts. The past was nothing but that and should stay like that. He would never think about it. He learned all he needed from the past. It was time to look towards the future. And he would make sure to do so. That night, for the first time in many years, he fell asleep with a smile on his face and with hopes for a better tomorrow. "Naruto." Rhonda called out. The blonde looked up at the man, the bread hanging from his mouth. He quickly grabbed it and placed it on the plate in front of him before it fell on the floor from his mouth. "I need to report to the castle. Can I ask you for a favor?" he asked as the blonde nodded vigorously. "Anything?" he said with a cheerful smile. The man smiled back. "Could you help my wife with the shopping today?" he asked as the blonde nodded. "It wouldn't be a problem to do that." Rhonda bid his farewell to the blonde and left the kitchen in search of his wife. The boy looked down at the plate and continued munching on the bread and ham happily. He felt like a little child. He acted like one. He knew that, and he didn't care. For a little while he wanted to have fun, to get back those years he lost. Once he was done, he cleaned the table and walked outside towards the river. He couched down and looked in the river at his reflection. He had to admit that he looked much better without the whiskers. He moved his hand through the cold water and shivered a little. He then smiled and stood up. The boy took a deep breath and looked around. He could see a watermill in the distance. Uphill, there were several windmills not far away from it, and from what the blonde assumed, some grain farms. "Ah, there you are," he heard Alejandra call out. He turned towards the house and saw her locking it up. She then walked towards him and smiled. "Ready to go?" she asked as the blonde nodded and followed her into the village. The boy looked around as they were greeted by everyone. When they stepped in the village, he saw old and young, the old ones sitting under the shade or working on their farms with the adults, while the young were running around and having fun. He blushed a little as he saw a few girls looking at him and winking in his direction. It didn't help that the knight's wife laughed at his reaction. "You're quite popular, and you only just arrived," she said with a grin as the blonde looked away with a blush. "Not my fault," he mumbled as the woman giggled. The two walked through the village buying from the farmer's goods. Naruto took care of carrying the bags. Alejandra introduced him to the townsfolk each time they met someone new. He didn't complain. He was happy to meet new people, and considering that he would stay here for quite some time, it was best to get to know everyone. After a few hours of walking and shopping from various farmers, they stopped at the village square. Alejandra wanted the blonde to rest a bit, and even though he told her that he could still go on, that he wasn't tired yet, she insisted that they took a break. The blonde sat on the bench and looked around as people passed by doing their daily business. He looked up at the sun and covered his eyes slightly. It was hot, but he liked it. "Don't you want to sit in the shade?" he heard the woman ask. He turned to face her. She was sitting under a tree's shade and eating an apple. The boy shook his head as he looked back up at the sky and leaned on the bench. "I'm used to the heat. It's quite relaxing once you get used to it," he told her. The woman smiled a bit as she moved her hand through her hair. "Was it harsh?" she asked, making the blonde look at her strangely. "I mean, how they treat people. I only read in the papers and I never met one that got to be free," she said in a low voice. The blonde sighed and looked at the sky as he replied to her question. "Do this, do that, sleep little, eat lesser," he said with a frown on his face. "There were times I wished I could end my life. he confessed as the woman looked at him sadly. "But I didn't, I wanted freedom more than anything and I knew I could attain it if only I tried," he said as he smiled cheerfully and extended his hands to the sky. "And I did it, didn't I?" he asked with a grin as the woman nodded smiling. "You are pretty brave, to take up arms and fight your way to freedom," she told him as she looked towards the sky as well. "It frightens me a little to be honest." The boy looked towards her curiously. "I always worry when my husband leaves, I worry that one day he will not return," she said in a low voice as the blonde looked away understanding what she meant. "It scares me sometimes as well," he confessed. "One wrong step, and it's over," he sighed as he shook his head and smiled. "But let's not talk about this, all right?" he asked with a grin. Alejandra looked at him and smiled softly as she nodded. The woman stood up and arranged her dress before looking at the blonde. "Let's go, we still got shopping to do," she said giggling slightly as the blonde sighed softly. 6 hours and she still needed to get more stuff. He smiled however, he enjoyed this. It was different from what he did up until now and it felt much better. He hoped that his life would only get better from now on. After a week the blonde had gotten used to the new place he was in. He got to know almost every person in the small village, mainly the farmers due to him always helping Alejandra with buying supplies. 4 days ago Rhonda had left to the castle and has yet to return. He said that he was on duty for an entire week. Before he left the knight gave the blonde several books on the history of Earthland and one book on the royal guard, as well as a training manual. The knight stated that he wished for the blonde to join the guard. His skills in combat would prove useful later on, that and the fact that he could use a hand in cleaning the mountain of all the beasts that attacked villages. To hire a mage you would need a lot of money. The high command of the royal guard wouldn't let Rhonda spend money from the treasury to hire mages, so they had to either gather money from their salary or go out themselves and hunt the beasts. Usually it was only wolves, bears and some low-level magical beasts, nothing that the royal guard couldn't handle. Stories told of a dragon living in the mountains, yet they knew that if such a being lived there they would have nothing to worry about. Times have passed and the dragons no longer hunted humans. Even so, that didn't put some men at ease. They were always on the lookout and ready to defend themselves should the dragon turn against them. Naruto didn't pay much attention to that, since he got the books he had been absorbed by them. To everyone it still looked like he was an amnesiac recovering. In truth, he really didn't know anything about this world. What caught his eyes the most was the stories about mages and, in particular, the dark mage Zarif. He shivered slightly at what the books said he could do. It reminded him of several ninjas, in a way. But there was no way he could compare Zarif to the ninjas that went in the history books back home, the evil ones. Dark magic was banned, hunted and when found, exterminated. He felt a little sorry for those that practiced this kind of magic, but at the same time he couldn't help but hate them. Why would one go to such lengths to attain power? He shook his head as he kept on reading. He had to admit that the man was genius, to construct living beings out of nothing. He then began to wonder if he had magic abilities. He could still feel his chakra, or maybe it was magic now, flowing through his veins. He could still access it and climb on walls. He had yet to show them this ability of his. He was afraid what they would think if they saw it, if they would link it to dark magic. Naruto felt that it was better to keep this a secret, to hide it from them. After all, there was no reason to use his chakra to climb walls here. Even though he had been for only 1 week, the entire place was calm. No dangers in sight, and from what he read, the world he was in wasn't at war with anyone and all the countries lived in peace. The next book he took great interest was the training manual. Ever since he was young he loved to train, to become stronger. Back then he had a dream, and to attain that dream he needed to grow strong. Now he didn't have a dream. All he had was an ambition. To protect the knight that saved him and offered him shelter and his wife. He spent the days outside with his dead katana. He tried to repair it himself but with no luck. The blacksmiths had no luck either in repairing the katana since they had never seen a model like that before. He tried to train with the katana even though he knew it would be useless. No one can train with a broken weapon. It was only a week later when Rhonda returned that he managed to get some proper training done. The knight brought a training sword with him and gave it to the blonde. Using that sword he was able to begin the first steps in the training manual and complete them with success. Rhonda had been impressed. The blonde was advancing faster than any recruit, and he was working on his own, not being drilled by an instructor. 2 weeks later the blonde was still going strong on his training. He had already learned everything about the world he was now in. He knew about magic, and when he was alone he trained in it, trying to unlock whatever magic powers he had. Taking a deep breath, the blonde placed his sword on the ground and leaned down, staring at the sky. It was summer, the sun was strong during this time of the year. He watched as the clouds passed by and remembered of one of his friends. While he had been a great strategist, it didn't serve him well on the battlefield. The blonde felt a pang of guilt. His friend had died because of him, because of one mistake he made. With a sigh, he erased his thoughts and kept going over the steps in his training. He knew how to hold a sword and how to fight with one. Using wood and some stone, he created a makeshift mace, and slowly he began learning how to use it. It didn't prove to be a hard task. It was almost like using a sword, almost. Sitting up, the boy looked towards the river. Almost a month, he whispered to himself. He still couldn't believe his luck. After all those years of planning and playing it safe, he finally managed to get away, and now he had the life he always wished for, or at least a part of it. Eleandra and Rhonda stated that they considered him like a son. Over the course of time they started to get to know him more and acted more like parents than friends. It brought a smile to the boy's face. It was something he had always wanted. A family. He slowly stood up and grabbed his sword. He assumed one of the attack positions he learned from the manual and began practicing swinging the sword up and down, slashing vertically. After a few minutes he took his training a step forward. He began imagining he was fighting an enemy. He moved his sword in front of him, in a vertical position to parry the imaginary attack. The blonde turned a little to the side and moved his sword above his head, lowering it down in front of him, cutting the imaginary foe. He slashed vertically once more before repeating all the moves again and again. In his mind he was fighting multiple foes. He always did train like this. Naruto. He heard someone call out. His eyes snapped open. He didn't even know when he had closed them, and turned to the source of the sound. He saw Eleandra walking on the road towards the house and waving at him. Behind her were two more women. One was the same age as her and the other the same age as the blonde. The boy smiled and waved back before turning his attention back to the foe he was fighting. He prepared to continue his exercise when Eleandra called him once more. Naruto, take a break. I want you to meet someone. He blinked once before twirling the sword through his fingers, something he always did with his katana in the past, and finally sheathed it. He bent down, picking up the training manual that was laying on the grass, and walked towards the woman. He smiled as he walked towards her. Anything I can help with? He asked, noticing the bags in her hands. The woman smiled and shook her head before turning to the side slightly so that he could see her companions. Naruto, I'd like you to meet an old friend of mine, she said, motioning to the woman. This is Maya. We grew up in the same village and we've known each other for a very long time. She's my closest friend, she said with a big smile as the boy studied the woman. She was a bit taller than Eleandra, by at least 2 centimeters, barely a difference in height in the blonde's opinion. She had long black hair with brown eyes. She was dressed like all the other village women. It's nice to meet you, he said with a bow as the woman smiled and bowed as well. It's a pleasure, Naruto-san. I've been hearing a lot of good things about you, she stated as the blonde chuckled and scratched his cheek. Eleandra giggled a little as she looked at the girl next to Maya. And this is Yuna, Maya's daughter, she said as the blonde looked towards the girl. Like her mother, she had long black hair. Her eyes, however, were a mix between brown and blue. Most likely her father had blue eyes. She was smaller than him in height by half a head. She smiled towards the blonde and bowed respectfully. He did the same, returning the smile. Have you been training since morning? Eleandra asked as she walked forward. Naruto nodded with a smile, making her shake her head slightly. You need to take a break from time to time, Naruto. He laughed at that. You'd be surprised how long I can go without getting tired, he told her as she sighed softly. Don't remind me, she then turned towards her friend and continued. Once he vanished for 3 days. My husband found him not far in the woods. He had been training for 3 days straight. No rest, no food. Hey, I did eat berries, the blonde mumbled before looking away with a light blush. Eleandra shook her head as she walked towards the house with her friend and Yuna behind her. The girl giggled at the blonde, making his blush intensify a little. You slept for 2 days straight after that. Now come on in and rest, she said as they entered the house. With a sigh, the blonde ran towards the door and stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He walked through the hallway till he reached his room and placed the sword and book on the bed. He grabbed a few clothes and walked in the bath for a quick shower. Once that was done, he dressed in his clean clothes and walked out of the room to the kitchen, where he found Alejandra talking with her friend. The girl was sitting at the table next to her mother and listening to the conversation, but not saying a word. Naruto walked next to his adoptive parent and sat down next to her. She extended a cup of tea to the blonde, who accepted it and thanked her. He took a sip from the cup and sighed happily. Alejandra made the best tea in the village. It always put his mind at ease. So, Naruto-san. Maya started. The blonde looked up at her. You planning on joining the royal guard in the castle? She asked as the blonde smiled and nodded. Randa-san said I'd make a great addition to the ranks. He said I would be able to make it knight commander if I keep it up like this. He laughed a little. He was in no hurry to attain such a high rank yet. I suggested he should become a farmer. Alejandra said, nodding to herself. The blonde huffed and looked away. But he has way too much energy and he's more of the adventurous type. The boy shrugged as he drank his tea. Ever since I was young I wanted to explore everything I could, he said. But you know that if you join the royal guard you won't get to have an adventure. It's all just guarding duty, rarely are the troops mobilized. Maya stated as Alejandra nodded in agreement. Once more the blonde shrugged. True, but you may never know. One day I might be guarding the gates, the other I might be hunting wildlife or bandits. He replied as his adoptive mother sighed and shook her head. And you worried too much. He told her with a big grin. She sighed as she shook her head. Why don't you go and chat with Yuna? And Maya have business to discuss in private, she said as the blonde shrugged and stood up. He walked over to the girl and offered her his hand. The girl blushed and took his hand, standing up on her feet. She followed the blonde outside. Naruto did his best to ignore the giggling of the two elder women. As he walked out of the kitchen he looked at the girl behind him and saw her blushing as well. He looked away and turned his attention in front of him, his mind drifting away. Another blush crept on his face as he realized he was going to spend a good portion of the day with a girl his age back in his old world. He didn't spend even 5 minutes with a girl. He didn't really know what to do or what to say to her. The boy gulped slightly. He didn't want to embarrass himself. Rhonda did tell him that the best way to make friends is to just be yourself. The old man back home told him the same thing. He was shaken out of his thoughts as he realized they were now outside near the river. When in deep thought, his body always brought him here. He looked behind him and saw the girl was admiring the scenery. Feeling his gaze on her, she turned to face him and smiled softly. So, the blonde started scratching the back of his head. The girl giggled slightly at that. Damn, this is harder than I thought. The blonde mumbled to himself, making her laugh. He looked up at her and smiled a little as he saw her laugh. He had to admit that she looked cute. After a few seconds she looked back at him and smiled. How about I start? She asked as she extended her hand to him. My name is Yuna. I was born here in the village. I'm 15 years old and I love flowers. She said as she leaned forward a bit. Especially white roses, she said, giggling as the blonde smiled warmly. He took her hand and replied. I'm Naruto. I was born in a faraway land. I'm 15 years old and I love reading. He told her as they shook hands. Mostly, I love reading mystery books. He finished as the girl gasped and smiled brightly. I love that genre. She exclaimed as she brought her hands together in front of her. What's your favorite? She asked as the blonde immediately answered with a big smile. A King's Plea, he replied as the girl smiled brightly. I love that one, she stated as the blonde laughed. What's your favorite part? She inquired as the blonde began talking. He began telling her about his favorite part, how the king in the story discovered how his own men were actually conspiring against him. Yuna listened to him as he talked, something that the blonde wasn't used to. No one, apart from his new family, had ever stayed to listen to him with such interest. Slowly the day passed and they got to know each other better. The blonde confessed that he wanted to do something good in this world, and since he didn't know if he had what it takes to be a mage, considering he was already 15 years old, he believed that by joining the royal guard he would be able to do something with his life. He would be able to protect innocent people. He was happy hearing that Yuna liked his idea, even though she admitted that the thought of someone close to her going into battle and dying scared her and that she would rather have them not be part of the army. Naruto felt happy. He did not know why. When hearing that, he reassured her that he was stronger than he looks and that it would take a dragon or even a demon to bring him down, if he could be brought down. Naruto listened to Yuna as she expressed her wish to become an actress. He stayed and watched her perform a scene from a novel she had read and was fascinated by her acting. He felt happy during the short time they spent together, talking and laughing. By the time the sun set they were still outside, talking and laughing. Before leaving they said they'd meet again the next morning, in the village center. He watched her with a smile on his face as she vanished in the horizon and ignored Alejandra and her giggling. "Someone fell in love, Tilda," she said with a smile on her face, poking the blonde on his shoulder. He blushed as he looked at her. "I did not," he exclaimed, clearly embarrassed. "I made a friend," he mumbled as the woman kept on giggling. He grumbled to himself as he walked back in the house, closely followed by Alejandra. A month had passed and life continued on as it has always did. The blonde found that the quiet life was not that bad in the end. He always dreaded that a quiet life would be boring. But it proved that there was always something to do, even if you weren't going to fight or train all the time. He spent the morning helping Alejandra with tasks around the house, the evenings either training or with Yuna, and the nights he usually spent them with the girl. There wasn't much to do in the village, but the little that they could do was enough. Naruto found out that even Yuna was adventurous a little bit. She liked to walk through the fields at night just to gaze at the stars. The surrounding area wasn't very dangerous, but threats still lurked at night. The blonde would usually carry his sword with him despite her reassurance that nothing would ever happen. Slowly, summer was coming to an end and the cold was approaching. Rhonda and Alejandra went with the blonde to the city to get him warmer clothes for the winter. While they were there, Rhonda visited an armorer with the boy to get an armor built for him. The royal guard didn't keep spare armors anymore and instead had a special armorer in close vicinity to a castle or keep where they made their armors. Same with the weapons. When he first tried the armor on, the blonde felt like weights from back home were dropped on his shoulder. He couldn't believe how heavy the armor was. He shocked them, however, when he proved to them that he could walk around with it and turn his body freely. As leaves began to fall from the trees, Naruto stayed days watching them. He watched as leaves changed colors and dropped on the ground. In Konoha it was rare to have cold weather, rarer to have a winter and for leaves to fall from trees. To Rhonda's amusement, the blonde acted like a little child when he first saw leaves falling from the trees, and to Yuna's amusement when he pointed to everything that was happening around them. "I never saw anything like this before," he told her with a sad voice on one of their meetings. "I believe they told you, I was a slave after my grandfather died, didn't have the luxury to see or to enjoy a scenery such as this." He explained and she understood perfectly. He didn't admit it, but he loved her, more than he used to love that pink-haired girl from back home. And unlike that one, this one was real love. The way she laughed and acted, she wasn't spoiled like others and enjoyed what she had, didn't ask or beg for more if it wasn't attainable. She listened to him and cared for his safety. During the month Rhonda and Alejandra officially adopted the blonde, he found out that their son died a long time ago when bandits raided the village. They didn't tell him this, he found out from Maya. The boy was happy to fill a little part of the void in their hearts, especially after everything they did for him. Rhonda had introduced him to the town watch, and from time to time he was placed with one of the night patrols, to look over the village at night. It was an uneventful job. He also used it as an excuse to visit Yuna at night as well, much to the amusement of his partner. "Naruto," the girl called. He turned around and smiled at the girl that was running towards him. It was early in the morning. He was currently returning home from a full night of patrolling. The blonde embraced her as she got close. "Good morning," he whispered as Yuna giggled. She looked at him and kissed him. "You going home?" she asked as the blonde nodded. The girl frowned slightly as she snuggled in his chest. "I wish we could spend the day together," she whispered. Naruto chuckled a little in response before kissing her on the head and moving his right hand through her hair. "We could, but I'd be like a zombie, barely able to stand up. And you know my mother, she wouldn't agree on going for more than 20 hours without sleep." Yuna giggled and nodded. Alejandra was strict when it came to the blonde's health, mostly because if no one looked after him then he would die of either thirst, hunger or lack of sleep. "There's a play tomorrow in the city," she said, looking in his eyes. "Can we go?" she asked, moving closer to him. He chuckled. She knew fully well that he would never say no to her. "Of course we can," he told her as she smiled brightly. "When does it start?" he asked. "It's at 8 in the night," she replied, and the blonde's smile dropped a little. He frowned slightly, knowing that it would be hard to convince both Alejandra and Maya to let them go, that they would be all right. "You worry too much," she said, giggling. Mother already knows and she has complete confidence in you." Naruto smiled at that. "At least one believes in my abilities," he whispered as he kissed her on the lips. "I should get going," he told her. Yuna nodded as she looked in his eyes. "Sleep well," she said as Naruto thanked her and kissed her one more time before leaving. There wasn't a day that passed uneventful. Even the next day on their trip back through the dark was uneventful. It was like no one wanted to cause trouble in a small place like this. He didn't complain. He loved the way things were. Everything was going peacefully, until one night when his life took a turn for better or for worse. It was close to October when it happened. The blonde was on night patrol, this time alone as his partner fell sick the other day. He didn't mind patrolling the streets alone, even though Eleandra disliked it and pestered him that he should call in favors and have someone else do the patrolling on this night. Naruto didn't like doing that. If he was going to join the royal guard, he needed to prove that he was capable of handling anything on his own, if necessary. Rhonda told him how there were times when a squad would get outnumbered. Everyone would need to take up multiple targets to keep up and protect their squad mates. If one would fall behind, they would all die. The boy was cut out of his mussing as he heard something. He came to a halt and looked around the dark street. There was no lighting on the streets. A small village cannot afford something so modern to be built. He lifted his light up and looked at the street. "Hello?" he asked. "Is there anyone out there?" No reply came. The blonde shrugged as he turned around and continued walking. It was probably just the wind. After walking for a few minutes, he arrived at what used to be the mayor's house. The village used to have a mayor in the past. He didn't know the full story, but from what he could understand, it seemed like the man had died due to a disease. No one wanted to take the role of mayor anymore as the old men were all superstitious and believed the seat was cursed. He laughed slightly before shaking his head. He was about to leave when he saw a light moving through the hallways of the large house. The boy lowered his own light and looked closer at the house. He saw the light again. He sighed. Most likely the damn youngsters were rummaging through abandoned houses at night again, playing pranks on each other and trying to scare themselves. With a sigh, he jumped over the fence and began walking towards the entrance. He rummaged through his pockets and brought out a large chain with keys. He flipped through the keys trying to find the right one. He stopped at the 13th key and grinned as he opened the door. The large door opened with a loud screech, making him twitch. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing through the empty hallways. Slowly he brought up the light and looked around the place. He shivered a little. The place gave him an eerie feeling. The wind blew all of a sudden, putting out the fire in his lamp. He cursed as he tried to find something, light it back up. "Something?" he heard a voice echo, barely audible. He listened carefully. "No, I didn't hear anything. Go check the door, you scaredy cat." This was louder, and the blonde was now sure there weren't any kids here. The one that spoke was older, in his 30s if he was right. Someone was trespassing. Slowly he closed the door behind him and walked away, hiding under the stairs. A few moments later he heard footsteps and light flooded the hallway. He peered from under the stairs and looked up. He could barely distinguish the man, but he was sure that he wasn't a villager. He was wearing leather armor and had a sword in his hand. "Peef, nothing here, just the wind," the man said as he turned around and began walking away. The blonde placed his lamp on the ground and unsheathed his sword. He crouched down and began walking up the stairs slowly. He cursed slightly as each step he took made the stairs squeak. Luckily the man was already far away and he didn't hear the noise. When he reached the top floor, he carefully moved in the direction he last saw the strange man go. The boy shivered slightly. This entire place gave him the creeps. After a few minutes he saw a light in one of the rooms and he could hear a commotion. He walked slowly towards the door and peered inside. There were 5 men there. 4 were wearing leather armor and seemed like they were just mercs, while the 5th wore a black robe. He stood in the middle of the room with his arms crossed over his chest. "Well?" the man asked in a rough voice as the mercs shook their heads. "Nothing here," one of them said. "Nor here," the second replied. "This is a waste of time," the third complained, slamming a drawer on the floor, papers falling all over on the ground. "Agreed," the last one stated, standing up and looking around. "Keep searching, I didn't pay you for nothing," the man stated. Naruto slowly moved inside the room and towards the cloaked man as he was the closest. However, before he could even get close enough, the man's head snapped to the side and then he turned towards the blonde. His hand extended towards him. An invisible force pushed the blonde away, making him fly towards the wall in the hallway. The mercs jumped on their feet and unsheathed their weapons. "What happened?" one of them shouted as the mage scowled. "Seems like one of the town watch discovered us. Finish him and then get back to work," he ordered as the man walked out of the room towards the blonde. Said blonde shook his head, getting rid of the dizziness. His eyes widened as he saw a sword moving close to him, ready to lob his head off. He ducked just as the sword was about to cut him and rolled out of the way. He jumped back on his feet and grabbed his sword. One of the mercs charged forward with his sword raised. The blonde lifted his sword and parried the attack. He moved to the side and slammed his elbow in the merc's face, making him pull back in pain. Before he could finish him off, his comrades charged forward. The blonde raised his sword, parrying an attack, and sidestepped the other. He cursed slightly, if only he had a shield. Back home he had been training with a wooden shield. That wouldn't have helped him here, and he always doubted that he would need it on his patrols. He regretted not bringing it here now, however, it might have proven useful. His eyes widened as he ducked under a swing. He was about to lose his life. With a growl he began attacking, slashing towards his foes and forcing them into assuming a defensive position. The Royal Guard had a tactic used to take the upper hand in a fight, consisting of rapid attacks against your foes so that they would either fall into a defensive position or retreat. With each slash the blonde felt himself getting tired. It required a lot of concentration and energy. Concentration so that he could keep track with his foe's movement so as not to be caught in a trap or be caught wide open for a strike, and energy to keep the pressure on the foe. The boy let out a battle cry as he raised his sword over his head and then lowered it on top of his foe. The merc parried the attack. He crouched from the sheer pressure of the attack. The blonde's fist suddenly connected with his face, making the merc fly back and crash into his comrade. He shouted in pain as he felt his comrade's sword pierce through his body. "You bastard!" The second merc shouted as he charged forward. The blonde parried his attack and sidestepped. He then moved forward, his sword slashing his foe. The man coughed blood as he fell on his knees and then face first on the floor. Naruto looked at the remaining two and assumed his position. The men tightened their hold on the sword and shivered slightly. They were about to attack when their leader stepped out of the room carrying a strange tome in his hands. "I found it, we're leaving," he said as he looked towards the blonde and extended his hand forward. The blonde's eyes widened as he felt the same pressure from before hit him head on and sending him flying throughout the hallway, crashing in the wall on the other end. He gasped for air as he fell face first on the ground moments later. The boy tried to stand up. He grit his teeth as he placed his right hand on the ground and shakily lifted his body up. The entire world was spinning around him. He looked up at the man before him, a mage no doubt. The man motioned for the mercs to finish him off. They grinned as they walked forward. Naruto was now scared. He felt powerless. He didn't want to die like this after attaining his freedom. He didn't want to leave this world yet. Then, he felt something call out. He felt something boiling inside him, different than his chakra and from any sensation he had felt before. The boy reached out for it. Anything that would save him was welcomed right now. Everything happened in 1 second. The mage's eyes widened when he felt a strange, yet familiar, power coming from the boy. He reacted as fast as he could, creating a shield in front of him. His mercs, however, were unlucky. The blonde's head snapped up and he extended his open palm towards them. And a blinding light shot out, ripping the flesh and taking the lives of the two mercs. As the light died down, the skeletons of the two mercs dropped on their knees with their heads down. The blonde stared in shock at what he had done. He literally ripped the flesh from the bones of the two men and destroyed all their organs. Then the unthinkable happened. The skeleton's head snapped up as they got on their feet and turned towards the mage. He watched and wondered what was happening. The mage was even amazed when the skeletons charged forward to kill him. But in the end, they were just bones barely holding up. The little magic that sustained them wasn't enough to make them strong and make them last. With a single attack he destroyed the attackers, their bones flying all over the hallway, hitting the walls and dropping on the ground. The mage turned his attention to the blonde as he extended his arm towards him. The same force from before slammed him on the ground. "Interesting, to wield such power," he whispered, clearly amused. "And you are a town guard? What would they do when they find out you have magic powers?" he asked as more pressure was added to the spell, making the blonde scream in pain. "Dark magic." The man laughed as he lifted the blonde up and threw him out the window. "So interesting," he mumbled to himself as he turned around and left, opting to leave the blonde alive for now. Outside, Naruto coughed as he processed what just happened. Killing was part of his life. He knew that sooner or later he would have to kill again. He was born a killer and most likely would die a killer. What scared was the magic he possessed. He began crying no matter how much his body hurt. He possessed dark magic, and worse of all, he had killed 2 men with it and reanimated their skeletal remains. Kyuubi, he mumbled to himself through grit teeth as the fox's voice echoed through his mind, as its last word resonated through his memories. In the end, he was never free from it. I curse you, Uzumaki. Its voice echoed throughout the boy's mindscape. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't make its voice go away. I curse you for all eternity. It shouted as the world around him vanished. Naruto groaned as he slowly opened his eyes. Once more the smell of antiseptics invaded his nostrils, making him groan louder. The hospital, again, he mumbled as he opened his eyes and looked around. There was no one in the room. He sighed a little. He was hoping to wake up and see someone. But then again, it was better like this. He didn't have to face his adoptive mother's wrath, or his father's lecture. He chuckled a bit before grabbing his chest in pain. He sighed at that and relaxed his body. The boy replayed the events in his mind. He brought his hands up and looked at them. He couldn't believe that the magic he possessed was dark magic. He was more than sure that it was Kyuubi's doing, that this is what the fox referred to when it stated that it would curse him. He scowled as he looked towards the window and let his hands drop on the bed. It was midday from what he believed. He was worried now, worried as to what to do with his magic. He couldn't show it to anyone, they wouldn't understand, and he just returned to where he started. The door suddenly opened and drew the boy's attention. He looked towards the newcomer and cringed. Rhonda stood in the doorway with an angry look on his face. He walked inside and closed the door behind him. He then walked towards the blonde's bed and sat down in the chair, crossing his arms over his chest. They stood in silence for minutes. Naruto didn't know what to say. He knew he screwed up. Do you know how worried we were? Rhonda started as the blonde lowered his head. No, he replied meekly as the man kept silent, his eyes scanning the boy in front of him. Why didn't you come and alert me? He asked. The boy cringed at the anger pouring out with each word the knight said. You could have died, he growled out. I thought that it was only the kids, again. He replied lowly as the knight narrowed his eyes. And yet when you realized that it wasn't the kids, why didn't you come and alert me? He asked once more as the blonde looked up. They would have left? And then, he was interrupted as his father raised his voice. And then what? He asked, glaring at the blonde. Was it really worth it? He asked once more as the blonde looked down at the sheets and shook his head, giving a soft no as a reply. The man sighed as he leaned in his chair. Your mother worried a lot. He laughed a little. She berated me that I shouldn't have agreed to let you be on the night watch. Rhonda shook his head. Sorry, the blonde muttered as Rhonda sighed once more. Tell that to your mother, he said as he looked towards the window, and your girlfriend. She was also worried. We barely convinced her to go home and rest. The blonde smiled a little. He felt happy knowing that people were worried about him, but at the same time he felt awful for making them worry in the first place. The two stood in silence for several minutes before Rhonda spoke once more. We found 2 dead bodies and 2 skeletal remains. What happened? He asked as the blonde fidgeted. He didn't know what to say about the skeletal remains. I killed the first 2. The boy started as Rhonda nodded. He had already assumed that. The other 2 were killed by the mage. He didn't like doing this, but the blonde had no choice but to lie here. He couldn't tell him that he used magic to rip the flesh of the bones of those 2 mercs. The knight stood in silence for a few minutes, contemplating on what the blonde said. What did they want? He asked. I don't know. The boy replied. He then remembered of the item the mage had taken before leaving. Ah, there was a book, or something like that. He said, looking towards the knight. They wanted a book that was in the house. Rhonda nodded while scratching his chin. I'll have to report this to the council. They'll know what to do. He muttered to himself as he stood up. He turned around and began leaving. Upon reaching the door, he turned slightly towards the blonde, though he avoided eye contact. I'm disappointed with your impulsive action. They were inside an abandoned house. No one would have been hurt. You could have reported first. He said before leaving the blonde alone to think. The next day he was visited by his mother and Yuna. Once more he had been berated, but this time by his mother. It was the first time he had seen her cry, and it was because of his rash actions. As for Yuna, he found himself in her hug the moment she entered the room. It was only after his mother began berating him that she let go of him. "How are you feeling?" Yuna asked in a low voice as she held his right hand. The blonde smiled as he tightened his hold on her hand. "Been better, sorry I worried you," he replied as the girl smiled and brought his hand closer to her. She kissed him lightly on the hand and smiled. "We were all worried, I prayed day and night for your well-being," she told him. He smiled at that. The doctors told him that he had been asleep for a week and that he didn't show signs of waking up anytime soon. He looked towards his mother who was sitting on the other side of the bed, her head down as she fiddled with her dress. "Mom," he started. She looked up at him. "I'm really sorry. Father already told me what I should have done, it won't happen again," he told her as she sighed and looked back down at her feet. "I know," she said in a low voice. Naruto remembered the discussion they had on the second day after they met, how she said she was always afraid of losing her husband on the battlefield. After they adopted him she said the same thing about him, she had already lost a son. Maybe I'll drop it," the blonde said, making Aleandra look at him. "Maybe I won't join the royal guard after all, and just be a farmer like you suggested," he told her with a smile. The woman looked at him with shock before smiling and laughing a little. She shook her head as she wiped a few stray tears away from her eyes. "No, follow your dream, but promise me you will never do anything like that ever again," she said as the blonde grinned and nodded. He then turned his attention to his girlfriend and smiled. "Promise me as well," she said with a smile as she leaned closer. "I promise," he told her. Aleandra stood up and walked out of the room, leaving the two as they began kissing. She smiled as she looked at the young couple and left them alone. Thanks for watching, guys.